On Bear Ridge, water means life. For 7 poor farming families, one creek is the difference between survival and ruin. But Cornelius Preston, a wealthy man with lawyers, judges, and greed on his side, believes every drop can be bought, diverted, and turned into profit. Standing against him are a feared mountain man and a widow everyone underestimated. They have no army, no fortune, and no powerful name, only an old ledger, a forgotten pact, and the courage to remind a broken town what community truly means.
The clock on Jeremiah Holt's wall ticked, loud, heavy. It was the only sound in the room, save for the wind rattling the frosted glass. Coldwater Creek was freezing over early this year. October carried the bitter bite of deep winter. Abigail Preston sat in the stiff leather chair, back straight, hands folded in her lap. She wore her mourning black. The heavy wool scratched her skin. She had worn it for 14 months. The town thought she mourned her husband. The truth was, she was mourning the 12 years she had lost to him. Holt cleared his throat. He was a plump, sweating man, even in the chill. He adjusted the spectacles on his nose. He looked at the thick parchment on his mahogany desk. Then he looked at Abby. It was that look. She knew it well. Pity, sprinkled with a healthy dose of male superiority. "I must be frank with you, Mrs. Preston," Holt said. His voice was thick with false sympathy. "The late judge's financial affairs, well, they are not as you might have assumed." Abby didn't blink. "Read it, Mr. Holt." He shifted in his chair. Josiah was a traditional man. He believed that the bulk of a family's legacy should remain managed by a firm hand. He picked up the paper. The house on Elm Street, the bank accounts in Denver, the shares in the Silverton coal mine, every last deed and dime. They have been left entirely to his older brother, to Cornelius Preston. The ticking clock seemed to echo. Abby sat perfectly still. 12 years. 12 years of keeping her mouth shut, playing the perfect, quiet, barren wife to a cruel man. She had managed that sprawling house. She had hosted his political dinners. She had smiled through the invisible bruises. And her reward was nothing. "I have 30 days to vacate, I assume?" she asked. Her voice was flat, emotionless. Holt looked surprised. He expected tears, hysterics. "Yes, Cornelius will arrive by the end of the month to take possession. He plans to sell the property. It is a difficult position, I grant you that." Holt folded his hands over his belly, leaning forward like a benevolent uncle. "But a woman of your refinement. You are still young enough, Mrs. Preston. 38 is not the end. You should return to your family in Kansas, or perhaps remain here and look for another good man to offer you protection. A widow cannot survive the winter alone. You need a provider, someone to manage your affairs." Abby felt the air leave the room. Not from shock, from clarity. The invisible cage she had lived in for over a decade suddenly came into sharp, undeniable focus. She stood up. Slowly. She didn't smooth her skirt. She just looked down at the sweating lawyer. "Do you believe a woman is merely a piece of property to be deeded from one man to the next, Mr. Holt?" Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the stuffy room like a razor blade. Holt blinked. His mouth opened and closed. I simply meant to offer sound advice, ma'am." "I know exactly what you meant," Abby interrupted. The words didn't tremble. They struck like hammer blows. "This society's structure relies on stripping us of our independence, only to turn around and call us fragile creatures who need saving. You men construct laws that forbid me from working. You create rules that deny me the right to own what I helped build with my own hands and my own sweat. Then you sit there behind your mahogany desk and tell me I must find another man just to survive the winter." Holt flushed red. "Mrs. Preston, that is highly improper." "It is the truth," Abby said, leaning forward, planting her gloved hands on his desk. "I am not a helpless creature, Mr. Holt. I am a human being. I have a mind, and I have a will. And I will not be passed along like a well-worn chair, simply because the law refuses to recognize my right to exist on my own terms." She didn't wait for his sputtered reply. She turned on her heel and walked out. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, finalizing the end of her old life. The street outside was a sea of frozen mud. Coldwater Creek was a town of whispers. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone knew Josiah Preston was a respectable, honorable judge. No one knew the man who locked the doors at night and used his words like scalpel blades. Abby pulled her shawl tighter against the wind. She reached into her reticule. $11.40. That was the sum total of her independence. She needed supplies. She had a plan. A desperate, foolish plan planted by a single entry in her late father's medical journal. Bear Ridge, the Montgomery place. Good people. Her father had written that 10 years ago. It was the only lead she had. Brennan's general store smelled of dried apples, kerosene, and gossip. Mostly gossip. Abby stepped inside. The bell jingled above the door. The low murmur of conversation by the pot-belly stove stopped dead. 3 women standing by the bolts of calico turned to look. Hester Doyle, the sheriff's wife, was among them. Hester had eyes like a hawk and a mouth that functioned like a telegraph wire. Abby ignored them. She walked straight to the long wooden counter. "Mr. Brennan, I need dried beans, 50 pounds of flour, coffee, salt pork, a good skinning knife, and I need to rent your roan mare." Old man Brennan stopped wiping the counter with his rag. He looked at her list. Then he looked at her face. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Preston? The Denver train don't run till Thursday." "I'm not taking the train," Abby said, counting out her coins. Clink, clink, clink. "I'm going up Bear Ridge." A sharp gasp echoed from the calico aisle. Hester Doyle dropped a spool of red thread. It bounced on the floorboards and rolled into the corner. Brennan leaned in close over the counter. His breath smelled of stale chewing tobacco and black coffee. "Mrs. Preston, you don't mean the Montgomery place." "That is exactly what I mean," Abby said, keeping her voice level. "I hear he has a working farm. A farm needs hands before winter sets in hard. I intend to offer my services." "Abigail Preston, have you completely lost your mind?" Hester bustled over, abandoning all pretense of minding her own business. Her face was flushed. "You can't go up there. Silas Montgomery ain't just unfriendly. He's dangerous." Abby didn't look at Hester. She kept her eyes on Brennan. "Pack the flour, please, Mr. Brennan." "You listen to me, Abby," Hester insisted, grabbing Abby's forearm. Abby calmly but firmly removed the woman's hand. Hester's voice grew shrill, frantic. "Did you not hear what he did 3 winters back? 2 cattle rustlers tried to cut his fence. Just 2 hungry boys looking for a stray calf. You know how they found him? Tied to the town limits sign. Beaten half to death, bloody pulps. And Montgomery didn't say a word. Just rode down, dumped him, and rode back up." Another woman chimed in from the stove. "They say he's a savage, a giant of a man. Don't come down to town for church. Don't speak to no one. They say the war broke his mind. He's a monster up on that ridge." Brennan nodded slowly, his face grim and lined with concern. "They ain't lying, ma'am. He's a hard, dangerous man. Lives completely alone. Ain't no place for a woman. Especially a refined widow lady like yourself. You go up that mountain, ain't nobody gonna hear you scream." Abby looked at Brennan, then at Hester, then at the other women staring at her with wide, terrified eyes. She thought of Josiah. Josiah with his perfectly trimmed beard, his expensive wool suits, his soft, perfectly clean hands that knew exactly how to grip her arm where the bruises would be hidden by her sleeves. Josiah was the very picture of a civilized gentleman. The town loved him. The town elected him. Society's definitions of danger were terribly, fatally flawed. The most dangerous men didn't live in the woods. They lived in parlors. "I'll take my chances," Abby said. Brennan sighed, shaking his head. He loaded the burlap sacks. He handed over a hunting knife with a bone handle. Abby slipped the knife into the deep pocket of her heavy wool coat. She paid her money. She had less than $2 left. She hauled the sacks out the door. The whispers started up again, the exact second the latch clicked shut behind her. She knew what they were saying. They thought she was crazy. They thought she was marching to her own funeral. Abby tied the supplies to the rented roan mare. She looked up. Beyond the rooftops of Coldwater Creek, Bear Ridge loomed against the gray sky. It was jagged, dark with pine trees, capped with early snow. It looked cold and unforgiving. But as the icy wind hit her face, it felt different today. It didn't feel like a punishment, it felt clean. They warned her the mountain man was a monster, a savage who knew nothing but violence. Abby pulled herself up into the saddle. She adjusted her skirts, took the reins in her gloved hands, and pointed the horse toward the tree line. She was done with civilized men. The wind bit hard. It smelled of pine and frost. The rented roan mare stumbled on the loose rocks. Abby held the reins tight. She didn't look back. Coldwater Creek was nothing but a gray smudge at the bottom of the valley. Good riddance. The trail up Bear Ridge was barely a trail at all, just a harsh, winding cut through the timber. It was steep. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that made your ears ring. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. Abby's hands were numb inside her wool gloves. Her thighs ached from the saddle, but her chest felt light. For the first time in 12 years, she was breathing air that didn't belong to Josiah Preston. She rode for 2 hours. The shadows grew long, the air turned bitter, the town's warnings began to echo in her mind. He's a savage, a monster, beaten half to death. She slipped her right hand into her coat pocket. Her fingers found the smooth bone handle of the skinning knife, just in case. Up ahead, the trees broke. A clearing. Abby pulled gently on the reins. The mare stopped, blowing white steam from her nostrils. Abby slid down from the saddle. Her boots hit the frozen mud. She tied the horse to a low branch. She walked the last 20 yards on foot, quiet as a shadow. She stepped through a thick patch of blue spruce, and she stopped dead. There was a cabin. Solid pine logs, chinked with mud, smoke curling from the stone chimney. It was neat, ordered, not the lair of a madman. But it wasn't the cabin that made Abby freeze. It was the man. He was massive, broad-shouldered, dressed in worn canvas and heavy wool. Silas Montgomery. He was kneeling in the dirt about 30 yards from the front porch. His back was to her. Abby's hand gripped the knife in her pocket. She waited for him to turn, to shout, to grab a rifle. He didn't. Instead, a sound drifted across the cold clearing. It was a low, ragged sound. It tore through the quiet mountain air. It was a sob. Abby let go of the knife. She took a slow step forward. Silas was hunched over. His huge hands covered his face. His shoulders shook violently. Before him was a tiny patch of cleared earth. It was no longer than Abby's arm. It was outlined carefully with white river stones. A tiny grave. He wasn't crying quietly. He was weeping. Raw. Unrestrained. The sound of a man who had held a mountain of grief in his chest until the weight of it broke his ribs. Abby stood perfectly still. The town had warned her about a beast, a killer. But looking at the trembling giant in the dirt, she didn't see danger. She saw a mirror. She knew exactly what that kind of pain felt like. She just hadn't been allowed to let hers out. A twig snapped under Abby's boot. The crying stopped instantly. The silence slammed back down. Silas stiffened. He didn't just stand up. He unfolded. He rose to his full height. He wiped his face with the back of a calloused hand. When he turned to face her, the broken father was gone. The defensive wall was up, iron and ice. His eyes were dark, deep-set, guarded. He looked at her heavy black coat. He looked at the horse tied in the trees. "You're lost," he said. His voice was gravel, low and rough. "No," Abby said. Her voice didn't shake. "I am exactly where I aim to be. I'm looking for Silas Montgomery. You found him. Now turn around. He pointed a massive finger back down the trail. Town's that way. Abby didn't move. She looked at the tiny grave, then back up to his face. I didn't come from town just to ride back down. I came for work. Silas let out a harsh breath. It wasn't a laugh. Work, you. He looked at her fine wool coat, at the neat bun of her hair. This ain't a parlor, lady. Ain't no tea to serve. I don't serve tea, Abby said flatly. I have 50 pounds of flour, dried beans, and salt pork on that horse. I need a place to stay the winter. I'll cook. I'll mend. I'll tend the stock. I'll work for my keep. Silas crossed his arms. They looked like tree trunks. No, go home to your husband. My husband is dead. Buried him 14 months ago. Silas's eyes flickered, just for a second, but the wall stayed up. Then go to your family. I don't need a woman up here. Winter's hard. The work is harder. It's a man's work. Chopping wood, mucking stalls. You wouldn't last a week. You don't have the capacity for it. Abby felt a familiar spark of heat in her chest. It was the same heat she felt in the lawyer's office. But she didn't let it burn out of control. She used it. She took 3 steps forward. She closed the distance between them. She looked straight up into his dark, guarded eyes. Listen to me, Mr. Montgomery, Abby said. Her words were sharp, measured. They carried the weight of 12 years of silence. Labor has no gender. This sweat, these hands, they prove I am an individual capable of survival, not a porcelain ornament meant for a man's display. Respecting a person begins with acknowledging their capacity to work and contribute. Do not look at my skirts and tell me what I am capable of. Silas blinked. He stared down at her, really stared. Most folks couldn't look him in the eye for more than 2 seconds. She wasn't flinching. The wind howled through the pines. Neither of them moved. You're Josiah Preston's widow, Silas said finally. It wasn't a question. Brennan told me about you last time I went down for salt. He said the judge kept you locked up tight in that big house. Josiah kept a lot of things locked up, Abby replied. I am no longer one of them. Silas looked past her. He looked at the heavy sacks on the horse. He looked at the sky. The clouds were thick, gray, heavy with snow. He looked back down at her. You don't ask questions about me. I don't ask questions about you. You sleep in the tack room attached to the barn. I cleaned it out last spring. Got a wood stove, keeps the wind off. Agreed, Abby said. You touch my stock, you do it right. You don't know how, you ask. Don't go guessing. Agreed. Silas nodded toward the grave. His jaw tightened. And you don't ask about that. I wasn't planning to, Abby said softly. Silas didn't say another word. He walked past her. He untied the roan mare and led her toward the barn. Abby watched his broad back as he walked away. The deal was struck. 2 broken people on a freezing mountain. It wasn't a home, but for the first time in her life, it was a choice. The first week was counted in bruises and blisters. Abby woke every morning before the sun broke the ridge. The tack room was small. It smelled of old leather and sweet hay. The little iron stove kept her from freezing to death, but just barely. She dressed in the dark. She traded her heavy morning coat for a thick wool sweater she found in a trunk. It was a man's sweater. It hung to her knees. She didn't care. It was warm. She and Silas moved around each other like 2 orbiting planets. Never touching, rarely speaking. She cooked. He ate. She washed. He chopped wood. It was a silent, heavy rhythm. But it wasn't a bad silence. Josiah's silence had been a weapon. He used it to punish her. Silas's silence was different. It was a shield. He used it to survive. Abby watched him. From the corner of her eye while she scrubbed the cast-iron skillet, through the frosted window while she kneaded dough. He worked with a brutal efficiency, no wasted movement. His hands were battered, calloused, but they were precise. He didn't strike the wood block in anger. He struck it with purpose. He kept the barn immaculate. The tools were oiled and hung on pegs. Everything had a place. Everything was cared for. By the 9th day, Abby's hands were raw. Her back screamed every time she bent over. But the food on the table was hot. The cabin floor was swept. The chickens were fed. She was earning her space. She was breathing. On the 10th morning, the rhythm broke. Abby was out by the woodpile gathering kindling. The air was sharp enough to cut glass. She heard a sharp, panicked whinny from the corral behind the barn, then a heavy thud. She dropped the wood. She ran. Silas was in the center of the corral. He was holding the halter of a massive black gelding. The horse was wild-eyed, terrified. It was dancing on 3 legs. Its right front leg was suspended. Blood dripped into the snow. A rusted iron fox trap lay in the dirt a few feet away. The horse must have stepped on it out in the brush. "Hold still, damn it," Silas grunted. He was holding a brown glass bottle of whiskey in his free hand. He tried to step closer to pour it on the gash. The gelding reared. Its hooves flashed in the air. Silas had to jump back, dropping the bottle into the snow. The horse scrambled backward, hitting the wooden fence hard. "He's terrified of you," Abby said. Silas whipped his head around. He hadn't heard her come up. "Get back in the house. He'll kick your skull in." "He's smelling your panic," Abby said. She climbed up the lower rung of the fence and slipped through the rails. She didn't run. She walked slow, very slow. "Abigail, stop." Silas's voice was a bark of warning. Abby ignored him. She kept her hands low, visible. She didn't look the horse in the eye. She looked at its chest. "He's too big for you to force, Silas," she said softly. Her voice dropped an octave. It became a steady, rhythmic hum. "You can't bully a scared creature into trusting you. True authority doesn't demand submission through force. It earns cooperation through calm. That's a truth for animals, and it's a truth for people." She took another step. The horse snorted. It pinned its ears back. Abby stopped. She waited. She hummed a low, tuneless melody, just a vibration in her throat. She took another step. She reached out, not for the halter, for the neck. Her gloved hand rested lightly on the thick black muscle. The horse flinched. But Abby didn't pull away. She just kept humming. Slowly, the white showed less in the horse's eyes. The frantic breathing slowed. "Give me the bottle," Abby said. She didn't look back at Silas. Silas picked the whiskey up from the snow. He stepped forward, slow and heavy. He handed it to her. Their fingers brushed. His hand was trembling, not from the cold, from the fear of losing the animal. Abby uncorked the bottle with her teeth. She kept her left hand firmly on the horse's neck. With her right, she poured the raw liquor directly over the deep cut above the hoof. The horse jerked hard, but Abby held firm. She leaned her weight against the shoulder. "Easy, easy now. I know it burns, but the burn means it's getting clean." She pulled a clean rag from her apron pocket. She wrapped the wound tightly, tying it off. When she stepped back, the horse lowered its head. It let out a long, shuddering breath. Abby turned to Silas. He was staring at her. The dark, guarded look in his eyes had shifted. It was replaced by something else, shock, and something close to awe. "You got a touch," he said quietly. "My father was a doctor," Abby said, wiping the blood on her apron. "He treated horses and people. Sometimes they act the same when they're scared." Silas looked at the horse, then back at her. "Thank you." 2 words. But coming from Silas Montgomery, they felt like a heavy gold coin placed in her palm. "You're welcome," Abby said. She turned and walked back to the woodpile. 2 days later, the sky fell. It started as a light dusting. By noon, it was a whiteout. The wind roared off the peaks, rattling the thick logs of the cabin. The temperature plummeted. Abby couldn't make it across the yard to the tack room. Silas told her to stay in the main cabin. She didn't argue. Freezing to death to prove a point was foolish. She sat in the wooden rocking chair by the stone hearth. Silas sat at the heavy oak table. He was repairing a broken leather harness with an awl and thick waxed thread. The silence stretched. It was thick, heavy. The storm outside raged, trapping them in a tiny wooden box of heat and quiet. Abby looked around the room. Really looked. Above the mantelpiece, resting on two wooden pegs, was a fiddle. It was beautiful wood. Cherry, maybe, but it was coated in a thick layer of dust. Two of the strings were snapped, curling uselessly over the bridge. Abby stood up. She walked to the fireplace. She reached up and lifted the fiddle off the pegs. It was surprisingly light. The scraping sound of Silas's awl stopped. Abby didn't turn around. She ran her thumb gently over the smooth wood of the neck. She thought about the music it used to make. She thought about the tiny grave outside, now buried under 2 feet of snow. She thought about the life this cabin used to hold before the music died. She wanted to ask. The question burned in her throat. Who played this? Why did it stop? But she remembered the deal. You don't ask about me. I don't ask about you. Josiah used to pry her open. He demanded every thought in her head. He believed he owned her secrets. Abby knew the damage that caused. She carefully wiped a patch of dust from the belly of the instrument. Then she lifted it back up and placed it gently on the wooden pegs, exactly where she found it. She turned around. Silas was watching her. His hands were still holding the leather harness. His eyes were intense, searching. It's a beautiful instrument, Abby said simply. She walked back to her rocking chair and sat down. Silas stared at her for a long moment. He saw what she did. He saw the questions she didn't ask. He saw the boundary she respected. He didn't say anything. He just went back to his stitching. But that night, when he poured the coffee, he filled her mug first. The storm broke on the third morning. The sky was a brilliant, blinding blue. The world was buried in white. Abby was in the small blacksmith shed attached to the barn. She was trying to fix the handle of a garden hose she had snapped prying ice off the water trough. She had watched Silas pump the bellows. It looked easy. It wasn't. She pumped the heavy leather bellows. The coals sparked, but the fire wouldn't catch right. She shoved the iron head of the hoe into the embers. Smoke billowed up, thick, black, and choking. It hit her right in the face. She coughed, waving her hands. She pumped the bellows again, harder. Another cloud of soot blasted her straight in the eyes. "Damn it," she muttered, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. It just smeared the black soot across her cheek. She heard a sound behind her. She spun around. Silas was leaning against the doorframe of the shed. His arms were crossed. He was watching her, and the corner of his mouth was twitching. Abby glared at him. "It is a defective forge." "The forge is fine," Silas said. His voice was thick. He was fighting it. "I am pumping it exactly as you do. You're suffocating the coals." His chest hitched. Abby planted her hands on her hips. She knew her face was completely black. "Silas Montgomery, are you laughing at me?" "I ain't laughing," he said, though his voice cracked on the last word. "You are. You are absolutely laughing." Silas looked at her soot-covered face. He looked at the broken hoe, and he lost the fight. He threw his head back, and he laughed. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a deep, booming sound. It started in his chest and echoed off the wooden walls of the shed. It was rusty, like a door hinge that hadn't been opened in years. But it was real. Abby stood there, holding the broken stick. She watched the giant of Bear Ridge laugh until his eyes watered. She didn't smile. But deep in her chest, the tight, cold knot she had carried from Coldwater Creek loosened, just a little. The monster was just a man, and the man was coming back to life. November set in like a clenched fist. The snow didn't melt. It piled. It hardened into a crust of ice that crunched like broken glass underfoot. Bear Ridge became an island in a sea of white. Abby and Silas settled into a rhythm. It was a quiet dance. Wood was chopped, bread was baked, horses were fed. They moved around each other with a careful, unspoken respect. The tension was gone, but the walls were still up. Then the outside world came knocking. It was a Tuesday, high noon. The sky was a pale, flat gray. Abby was on the porch, shaking out a heavy wool rug. A horse snorted at the edge of the tree line. Abby stopped. She dropped the rug. Silas stepped out of the barn. He held a pitchfork in his right hand. He didn't raise it, but his knuckles went white around the ashwood handle. A rider broke through the pines. He wasn't a local. Locals rode sturdy Mustangs or quarter horses. Locals wore canvas and sheepskin. This man was riding an expensive bay thoroughbred. He wore a bowler hat and a long coat of fine black broadcloth. A city man. He looked terrified. The horse picked its way across the frozen yard. The man pulled up 10 feet from Silas. He looked at the giant holding the pitchfork. He swallowed hard. "Silas Montgomery?" the man asked. His voice cracked. "State your business," Silas rumbled. The city man reached into his breast pocket. Slowly. With 2 trembling fingers, he pulled out a thick envelope made of heavy parchment. It was sealed with red wax. "I am a clerk for the District Court of Denver," the man said. He leaned down, extending his arm as far as he could without leaving the saddle. "I am ordered to serve you with this notice. From the legal offices representing Mr. Cornelius Preston." Abby felt her heart skip. Then it slammed against her ribs. "Cornelius." Silas didn't move. He looked at the envelope, then he looked at the man. "I don't know a Cornelius Preston. Get off my land." "Sir, you have been served," the clerk squeaked, dropping the envelope into the snow. He didn't wait for a reply. He yanked the reins and spurred the thoroughbred back down the mountain, fast. Silence rushed back into the clearing. Silas stood staring at the envelope in the snow, like it was a rattlesnake. Abby walked down the porch steps. Her boots crunched on the ice. She stopped beside Silas. She reached down and picked up the envelope. The red wax seal felt cold and heavy in her hand. "Open it," Silas said. His voice was tight. Abby broke the seal. She pulled out 3 pages of closely typed text. She scanned the first page. Her eyes darted back and forth. The legal jargon was dense, built to confuse, built to intimidate. "Well," Silas asked, "what does the city want?" "It's not the city," Abby said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "It's Cornelius, my brother-in-law." Silas turned his head. He looked at her, really looked at her. "He's filing an injunction," Abby continued, flipping to the second page. "He is claiming that the water rights originating on Bear Ridge do not belong to this farm. He's claiming they belong to a broader tract of valley land he just purchased. He intends to divert the creek at the base of the ridge." Silas let out a harsh breath. "He can't do that. My father claimed this land 20 years ago. The water runs through my property. It's my water." "Under common law, yes," Abby said. Her eyes narrowed at the 3rd page. "But he isn't using common law. He's using an old loophole. He's citing terms from an 1848 Mexican land grant. He's filed a claim that the creek is a curso de agua público, a public watercourse under the old territorial laws, and he has a judge in Denver ready to sign off on it." Silas stared at her. His brow furrowed. "A what?" "A public watercourse," Abby repeated. "He's arguing that your father's deed only covers the dirt, not the water. If the court agrees, Cornelius can legally divert the creek. He'll dry out the entire valley below. Every small farmer down there will go bankrupt by August, and Cornelius will buy their land for pennies." Silas took a step back. The pitchfork lowered. The massive, dangerous mountain man looked entirely lost. "It's a trap," Silas said quietly. "It's a paper trap. You can't fight paper with an axe. I can read English, Abby, but I can't read that. I don't know what those Spanish words mean. I don't know how to fight a Denver lawyer." He looked defeated. A man realizing the ground was being cut right out from under his boots. Abby folded the papers. She held them tight in her fist. She looked up at Silas. "You don't have to," she said. Silas frowned. "What are you talking about? How do you even know what that means? How do you know Spanish land grant terms?" Abby squared her shoulders. The biting wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't brush it away. She looked straight into his dark eyes. Because I read them, Silas. I read them all. Josiah Preston let you study law? Josiah Preston didn't let me do anything, Abby said. Her voice was sharp. It rang clear in the cold air. He left me locked in a house with a library. He thought books were safe. He thought a woman's brain was too weak to comprehend complex legal theory. He thought I was just looking at the pictures. She stepped closer to Silas. She didn't whisper. She spoke with absolute authority. Society is terrified of female intellect. When a woman reads the law, when she understands the mechanisms of power, she is accused of stepping out of her natural place. Men like Josiah and Cornelius build systems in a language they think we can't speak, just to keep us helpless. But intelligence has no gender, Silas. I read Josiah's law library to keep my mind alive while my body was trapped in that marriage. I learned the old Mexican property laws. I learned the Water Rights Acts. I used it to survive. Silas didn't speak. He just looked at her. I am not a victim on this mountain, Abby stated, tapping the heavy parchment against his chest. I am a weapon. Cornelius thinks he is dealing with a lone, uneducated blacksmith. He doesn't know I'm here, and he certainly doesn't know that I understand exactly how to break his trap. Silas looked down at the papers, then back up to her face. The shock in his eyes slowly melted. It morphed into something else. Respect. Deep, undeniable respect. Then we fight him, Silas said. Yes, Abby nodded. We fight him. The kerosene lamp hissed on the oak table. It cast long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls. The fire popped in the hearth. The wind howled outside. But inside the air was thick with focus. Abby had the 3 pages of the injunction spread flat. Beside it, she had unrolled a brittle, yellowed map of Bear Ridge and the Coldwater Creek Valley. It belonged to Silas's father. Silas sat across from her. He leaned forward. His massive forearms rested on the table. He watched her finger trace the blue line of the creek on the map. Right here, Abby pointed. This is where the creek drops off your property line and hits the valley floor. The Ortega farm is right there, Silas said, his voice a low rumble. Then the Miller place. Then the Swensons. Exactly, Abby said. 7 farms rely on this water. Cornelius isn't just trying to steal from you. He's stealing their futures. If he gets this injunction, he can build a dam right at the property line. He'll divert the water east toward the proposed railway junction. She looked up at him. The lamplight caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes. He isn't stealing water, Silas. He's buying a monopoly. He's starving them out. Silas leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked under his weight. He looked at the map. His face was a mask of hard, weathered stone. My father dug that lower ditch, Silas said quietly. Abby paused. He did? By hand, Silas nodded. Summer of '62. It was a drought year. The creek was running low. The Ortega well dried up. Their crops were dying. My father spent 2 months out there with a pickaxe and a shovel. Dug a trench a mile long to make sure the water pooled down by their property before it ran off. Abby watched him. The hard edge of the mountain man was gone. He was just a son remembering a good man. He didn't have to do that, Abby said softly. He told me it wasn't a choice, Silas replied. He looked at her through the lamplight. My father believed that you can own the dirt under your boots, but you can't own the water. The water belongs to God, and God expects you to share it. He tapped a thick finger on the map. Cornelius doesn't understand that. To a man like him, water is just a coin in his pocket. Abby felt a tight ache in her throat. She understood now why Silas stayed on this brutal mountain. It wasn't just to hide. It was to guard a legacy. We need a counter-argument, Abby said, pulling the papers back toward her. If we can prove that the water has been in continuous shared community use prior to the Railroad Act, we can nullify the Mexican land grant loophole. How do we prove that? I don't know yet, Abby admitted. But I will find it. I just need time. Time is short, Silas said. He looked toward the shuttered window. Men like Cornelius don't just send paper. They send teeth. Silas was right. The teeth arrived the very next afternoon. The sun was high, but it offered no heat. Abby was walking from the tack room to the cabin carrying an armful of split cedar. She heard a crunch in the snow, not the heavy, familiar tread of Silas's boots. This was a scraping sound. Careless. She stopped. She turned her head. Two men were standing at the edge of the clearing. They wore heavy wool coats and city bowlers. They had brand-new Winchester repeating rifles resting casually in the crooks of their arms. They were looking at the cabin, looking at the barn, assessing. Abby felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit her stomach. Cornelius's men. Before she could shout, the barn door swung open. Silas stepped out. He didn't have his rifle. He didn't even have an axe. He just had a heavy leather blacksmith apron on, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows despite the freezing cold. His forearms were corded with muscle and smeared with black soot. He walked to the center of the yard. He stopped between Abby and the two strangers. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his hands. He just stood there, like a mountain of granite that had grown right out of the frozen earth. The two men stopped assessing the property. They assessed Silas. The taller man shifted his Winchester. He forced a smile. It looked like a grimace. "Afternoon, friend. Bitter cold out here." Silas didn't blink. He didn't speak. We're hunting," the second man said. He pointed vaguely at the tree line. "Got turned around. Didn't realize there was a homestead up this high." It was a lie. The snow was 2 feet deep. They were wearing flat-soled leather city boots. They hadn't come to hunt deer. They had come to hunt Silas, to gauge the threat, to see if the savage of Bear Ridge could be scared off. Silas knew it. Abby knew it. The men knew it. The men knew. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. Silas just stared at them. His dark eyes were bottomless. There was no fear in him. And more terrifyingly, there was no anger. There was just absolute, unyielding presence. It was the look of a man who had survived a war, survived the death of his family, and had absolutely nothing left to lose. The tall man's smile faltered. He looked at his partner. His partner took a small, involuntary step backward. "Well," the tall man cleared his throat. "Reckon we'll head back down. Find the trail. Good day to you." They backed up, slowly at first. Then they turned and walked quickly into the pines. Within a minute, the crunch of their boots faded away. Silas didn't move until they were completely gone. Then he turned and looked at Abby. "You okay?" he asked. His voice was calm, steady. Abby let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Yes." She looked at him in wonder. She had grown up around men who used violence to prove their strength. Josiah had broken plates against walls. He had screamed. He had threatened. Silas hadn't even raised his voice. Abby walked up to him. She dropped the firewood into the basket on the porch. She turned back to face him. "You didn't reach for your gun," she said. "I didn't need to," Silas replied. He wiped a streak of soot off his forehead. "Guns make noise. Men like that don't respect noise. They just respect boundaries." Abby shook her head slowly. "The town told me you were a savage. They said you were a violent beast who solved everything with your fists." Silas looked away. He looked toward the tiny rock-lined grave in the distance. "I was violent once. When they tried to steal my horses 3 years ago, I lost my mind. I beat those boys until my hands bled. I let the rage out. But it didn't fix anything. It didn't bring my family back. It just made me hate myself." He looked back at Abby. His eyes were entirely unguarded. "I don't want to be that man anymore," he said softly. Abby stepped closer to him. She didn't touch him, but her voice was firm, clear. "There is a profound difference between a man of violence and a man of peace," Abby told him, speaking the words into the freezing air so they couldn't be misunderstood. "A weak man uses violence to mask his fear. He dominates others because he cannot control himself. What you just did was not weakness. It was restraint. True strength isn't the ability to destroy your enemies. It is the discipline to hold your ground and protect what matters without becoming a monster in the process. You are a good man, Silas Montgomery." Silas stared at her. His chest rose and fell in a deep breath. For the first time in 4 years, someone had looked at him and seen a man instead of a beast. "Come inside," Silas said quietly. "We have papers to read." The freezing rain started on a Thursday. It didn't let up for 3 days. It wasn't snow. Snow you could shovel. Snow you could sweep. This was ice. It fell from the sky like little silver bullets. It coated the trees, the barn roof, the ground. It turned Bear Ridge into a giant, slippery tomb. Silas had to fix the pasture fence. A dead pine had snapped under the weight of the ice and crushed 30 feet of rail. If he didn't fix it, the horses would wander off the ridge and break their legs in the ravines. He was out there for 10 hours. Abby watched him from the cabin window. The gray light faded into black. Still, he didn't come in. She kept the fire roaring. She kept a pot of stew hot on the iron hook. When the door finally opened, it didn't swing. It hit the wall with a heavy thud. Silas stood in the frame. He looked like a drowned bear. Water poured off his waxed canvas coat. His face was gray, not pale, gray. His lips had a faint blue tint. He took one step inside. He didn't take a second. His knees buckled. He hit the floorboards hard. The whole cabin shook. Abby didn't scream. She moved. She ran to him, dropping to her knees. He was shivering, a violent, bone-rattling shake. His skin was freezing, but beneath it, heat was radiating out of him like a furnace. Fever. "Silas," she tapped his cheek. "Silas, open your eyes." He groaned, a low, ragged sound. His eyes rolled back under half-closed lids. Abby didn't waste time trying to lift him. He weighed well over 200 pounds. She grabbed his boots and dragged him inch by inch closer to the hearth. Her muscles burned. Her breath came in short gasps. She got him onto the heavy wool rug. She stripped off his soaked coat, his frozen boots, his wet flannel shirt. His chest was covered in scars, pale, jagged lines from a war nobody talked about anymore. She covered him in every blanket she could find in the cabin. She dragged her own quilts in from the tack room. She piled them on. Then the long night began. The fever spiked around midnight. Silas stopped shivering and started sweating. Profusely. He tossed his massive head from side to side. He fought the blankets. Abby sat beside him on the hard floor. She dipped a clean cloth into a bowl of cold water. She wrung it out. She laid it across his burning forehead. When it got hot, she dipped it again. Over and over. Around 2 in the morning, the delirium hit. Silas's hands clenched into fists. He was fighting ghosts. "No," he muttered. His voice was hoarse, dry. "Hold the line. Hold it." Abby wiped his face. "You're safe, Silas. You're home." He didn't hear her. The war faded, but something worse took its place. The deep, buried things. "Margaret," he breathed. It was a plea, a desperate, broken sound. "Margaret, please, I can't stop the bleeding." Abby froze. Her hand hovered over his chest. "I tried," Silas choked out. A tear slipped from the corner of his closed eye. It cut a clean track through the soot and sweat on his face. "I tried, Margaret. Don't leave me with just the quiet, please." He reached out blindly. His large, calloused hand grasped the empty air. Abby took it. She held his hand in both of hers. She squeezed tight. "I'm here," she whispered. "Rose," Silas sobbed. The giant of the mountain. The man who scared away armed thugs with a look. He was crying like a lost child. "She's so small, Maggie. She's too small for the ground. I can't put her in the cold." It broke Abby's heart. It cracked it right down the middle. She didn't let go of his hand. She sat there in the flickering firelight, and she let him pour his grief into the dark. She stood watch over his shattered soul. By dawn, the fever broke. The gray light filtered through the frosted window. Silas lay still. His breathing was deep and even. Abby was asleep, sitting up, leaning against the stone stones of the hearth. She still held his hand. Silas opened his eyes. They were heavy, achy. He looked at the wooden ceiling. He felt the pile of blankets. He felt the small, warm hands holding his right fist. He turned his head. He looked at Abby. Her hair had fallen out of its neat bun. There were dark circles under her eyes. She looked exhausted. And then the memory of the night hit him. He remembered the heat, the shadows. He remembered calling out the names. He remembered the tears on his face. He pulled his hand away, fast, like he had been burned. Abby woke with a start. She blinked, looking around. Then she looked down at him. "Your fever broke. How do you feel?" Silas sat up. He pulled the blankets up to his chest. He didn't look at her. He looked at the floor. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscle jumped. "I'm fine," he said. His voice was rough, defensive. "Shouldn't have been out in the ice so long. Foolish." "You were sick, Silas. Very sick." "I said I'm fine." He rubbed his face roughly. "I talked in the night." "You had a high fever," Abby said gently. "I talked," Silas repeated. He finally looked up at her. His eyes were full of shame, deep, bitter shame. "I lost my mind. I acted like a weak fool, blubbering like a whipped dog. I'm sorry you had to see that." He started to push himself up, to run away from it, to build the wall back up. Abby stood up. She didn't step back. She stepped right in front of him. "Stop," she said. Silas froze. Abby looked down at him. Her face was deadly serious. There was no pity in her eyes, only absolute conviction. "You listen to me, Silas Montgomery," Abby said. Her voice was steady. It rang in the quiet cabin. "You are not a whipped dog, and you are not weak." Silas looked away. "A man doesn't break down like that." "A man who loves deeply breaks down exactly like that," Abby corrected him, her tone firm. "Look at me." He slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. "Grieving for a lost life is never a weakness," Abby told him, speaking each word as if it were carved in stone. "Society tells men that to be strong you must be made of iron, that you must feel nothing. That is a lie. Only cowards use violence and a heart of stone to mask their fear. They run from their pain because they are terrified of it." She took a breath. The fire popped behind her. "What you did last night, what you carry inside you, that takes a strength most men will never know. The fact that you are brave enough to face your pain, to weep for the wife and child you loved, to keep their memory alive, that is the true definition of a man's courage. Do not ever apologize for your tears in this house. They are the proof that you have a heart." Silas stared at her. The breath hitched in his chest. No one had ever said that to him. No one had ever given him permission to be anything but a rock. The shame slowly drained out of his dark eyes. The tension left his broad shoulders. He looked at Abby. He saw a woman who had survived a monster, telling him that he was nothing like the monsters she knew. "Thank you," Silas whispered. Abby nodded. She picked up the empty water bowl. "I'll make coffee. You rest." For the first time since the fever hit, Silas smiled. A small, real smile. "Make it strong." December brought a sky the color of lead. The cold was absolute. It froze the creek solid. It froze the sap in the pines. It froze the air in your lungs. Abby had spent 2 weeks studying the Mexican land grant loophole. She had Silas's father's map spread out on the table constantly. She was building a defense, a solid one. But Cornelius Preston didn't play by the rules of defense. He forced the offense. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Silas was in the barn chewing the roan mare. Abby was in the cabin drafting a legal letter to the territorial judge in Denver. A knock hit the heavy oak door. 3 sharp raps. Abby stood up. She walked to the window and peered out. It was a man in a thick buffalo coat. He wore a silver star pinned to his chest, a U.S. Marshal. Beside him, sitting on a sturdy gray gelding, was Cornelius. Abby's blood ran cold. Cornelius looked exactly as she remembered, impeccably groomed, a sharp, cruel smile beneath a neatly trimmed mustache. He looked at the cabin with the casual disdain of a man appraising a slaughterhouse. Abby opened the door. The bitter wind rushed in. Cornelius raised an eyebrow. Well, the rumors in town were true. Hello, Abigail. You've fallen quite far from Elm Street. Abby didn't look at him. She looked at the marshal. Can I help you? The marshal pulled a folded document from his coat. Looking for Silas Montgomery. Silas stepped around the corner of the cabin. He held a heavy blacksmith hammer in his right hand. He saw the star. He saw Cornelius, his jaw set into stone. I'm Montgomery, Silas said. He walked up to the porch. He didn't look at Cornelius either. The marshal handed him the paper. Emergency injunction, sir, signed by District Judge Hemlock in Denver. Validates Mr. Preston's claim to the water rights under the 1848 Territorial Clause. Silas looked at the paper. Then he looked at Abby. What does this mean? Silas asked her. Cornelius answered before she could. It means, Mr. Montgomery, that the creek is mine. And because the creek headwater is located in the center of your property, the court has granted me an easement, a permanent one. Cornelius leaned forward in the saddle. The cruel smile widened. I am bringing a crew of 50 men up here next Monday. We are digging a diversion channel, right through your pasture, right through those pine trees in the back. Silas went rigid. The pine trees in the back. The graves. You can't dig there, Silas said. His voice was dangerously low. The hammer in his hand trembled. That is a family plot. Not anymore, Cornelius said lightly. It's a commercial water route. You have 5 days to relocate any personal items. Or the earth movers will do it for you. Silas lunged. He didn't think. The red haze of panic and pure, unadulterated terror blinded him. He dropped the hammer. He reached for Cornelius to pull him off the horse. The marshal drew his Colt .45. The click of the hammer cocking sounded like a cannon shot in the cold air. Hold it right there, Montgomery, the marshal shouted. You touch him, I drop you. Law's the law. Silas stopped. He was breathing hard. His chest heaved. He looked at the barrel of the gun. He looked at Cornelius's smug face. 5 days, Cornelius tipped his hat. Good day to you, Abigail. They turned their horses and rode down the trail. Silas stood in the snow. He didn't move. The silence was deafening. He was losing them. He was losing Margaret and Rose all over again. They were going to dig them up like weeds. Abby walked down the steps. Silas, look at me. We can fight this. The injunction isn't final until the hearing. Silas spun around. His eyes were wild. The fear had nowhere to go, so it turned into the only thing he knew how to use. Rage. He looked at the injunction in his hand. He looked at Abby. You, Silas hissed. Abby stopped. What? You're a Preston, Silas stepped toward her. His voice was a harsh, ugly growl. Josiah's wife. Cornelius's sister-in-law. You share the name. You sat at their tables. Silas, you know why I left. Do I? He interrupted, his voice rising. Do I know anything? You show up here out of nowhere. A judge's wife, playing the poor widow. You read the law. You translate the documents. And suddenly Cornelius is on my front porch with a signed order to rip my family out of the dirt. Abby stared at him. The betrayal felt like a physical blow to her stomach. You think I'm part of this? I think I'm a fool, Silas shouted, throwing the paper into the snow. I think I let a Preston into my house. Did he send you? Keep the dumb mountain man busy? Gain his trust so he wouldn't see the knife coming? Abby didn't shout back. The fire in her chest didn't explode. It froze solid. She looked at the wild, angry man in front of her. She didn't see Silas. She saw Josiah. She saw the same paranoia, the same desperate need to tear someone else down to feel in control. "I see," Abby said softly. She turned around. She walked past him. She walked straight into the tack room. She didn't slam the door. She opened her small leather bag. She folded her heavy wool sweater. She placed her father's journal inside. It took her exactly 3 minutes to pack everything she owned. When she walked back out, Silas was still standing in the snow. The rage had burned off. The cold reality of what he had just done was settling over him like a suffocating blanket. He saw the bag in her hand. He saw the dead, flat look in her eyes. Panic hit him again, a different kind. "Abby," he said. He took a step forward. He reached a hand out. "Do not touch me," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it stopped him like a brick wall. "Abby, I didn't mean it. The graves, he's going to destroy them. I lost my head. I'm sorry. Please." Abby stood on the porch. She looked down at him. She tightened her grip on the handle of her bag. "Being afraid does not give you the right to destroy me," Abby said. Her voice was steady, rhythmic, and absolutely devastating. "You think because you didn't strike me with your fist that you are a good man? You are wrong." Silas swallowed hard. He couldn't look away from her eyes. "Just because Josiah never struck me doesn't mean he didn't abuse me," Abby told him, the words sharp and clear. "Isolation, gaslighting, and paranoid accusations are the cruelest blades you can take to a person's dignity. You take a person's truth, and you twist it to make them the villain. You just used his exact weapon against me." She walked down the first step. Silas backed up. "I refuse to be collateral damage to your fear," Abby continued, laying out the boundary without a trace of hesitation. "I refuse to be called a liar. I survived 12 years of a man treating me like a problem to be managed. I will not tolerate it from you. I have the right to be seen as a whole, independent human being, not an extension of the men who hurt me, and not a punching bag for the man who is supposed to be my partner." Silas closed his eyes. The weight of his mistake crushed him. He had become the monster she ran from. He had let his fear turn him into Josiah Preston. He didn't make excuses. He didn't beg. He opened his eyes. He looked at the snow. Then he looked at her. "You're right," Silas said. His voice was a raspy whisper. "You are completely right. I used my fear to hurt you. It was cowardice, and I am deeply, truly sorry." He took 3 steps backward. He created space. He gave her the path to the horse. "I will saddle the mare for you," he said. He kept his eyes lowered, respecting her boundary, respecting her agency. "I'll pack provisions. You'll make town before dark." Abby watched him. He wasn't manipulating her. He wasn't demanding forgiveness. He was taking responsibility. He was letting her go because he knew he had broken the rules of respect. That was the difference. Josiah never apologized. Josiah never stepped back. Abby looked at the mountain. She looked at the tiny graves covered in snow. She looked at the man standing 10 feet away, waiting for his punishment. She set her bag down on the porch. Silas looked up. Shock registered on his face. "I'm not leaving," Abby said. "Why?" he asked. "Because you know the difference between right and wrong, and because Cornelius is expecting us to turn on each other." Abby stepped off the porch. She picked up the injunction from the snow and brushed it off. "Now I am going to make some coffee, and then we are going to save your farm." The cabin smelled of old paper and dust. Abby sat on the floor. Her knees were crossed. The heavy iron-bound trunk that belonged to Silas's father was open between them. It was filled with history, deeds, receipts for seed, letters from back east. Silas sat in a wooden chair nearby. He handed her stacks of paper. His hands were gentle with the brittle pages. "Look for the year 1864, Abby said. Her voice was steady. The fight from the porch was over. They had an enemy to kill, and they were going to do it with ink. You said there was a drought. You said he dug the trench for the Ortega farm. He would have documented it. Silas nodded. He pulled a thick, leather-bound ledger from the bottom of the trunk. He kept a journal, daily chores, weather, everything. He handed it to Abby. She opened it. The handwriting was sharp and slanted. She flipped through the heavy pages. 1862. She stopped. She ran her finger down a page dated May 14th, 1864. Here, she breathed. Her eyes scanned the ink. Silas, listen to this. She cleared her throat. The creek is running dry. Met with Miguel Ortega, John Swenson, and the others at the crossroads. We agreed the water cannot be dammed. We drew up a pact, signed by all 9 families bordering the runoff. Bear Ridge water is shared water. Unanimous consent required to alter the flow. Filed a copy with Judge Crawford in town. Abby looked up. Her eyes were wide. A mutual-use water pact. It requires unanimous consent. Cornelius only bought the Miller tract. He doesn't have the consent of the other 7 families. Silas leaned forward. The heavy burden on his shoulders seemed to lift just a fraction. Does that beat his injunction? It doesn't just beat it, Abby said. A fierce, triumphant smile touched her lips. It buries it. That pact predates the Railroad Act. It predates the Mexican land grant loophole he's using. It establishes continuous community use. She reached out to turn the page. But as she did, a loose piece of paper fluttered out of the ledger. It landed softly on the wooden floorboards. Silas reached down and picked it up. It was a receipt. He looked at it, his brow furrowed. The blood slowly drained from his face. What is it? Abby asked. Silas didn't speak. He just handed it to her. Abby took the fragile slip of paper. It was dated November 1869, the year Silas's wife, Margaret, had caught the winter fever. It was a receipt for medical services, paid in full. 2 sacks of flour and a cured ham. At the bottom of the paper, signed in a familiar, sweeping script, was a name. Dr. William Bauer. Abby stared at the ink. Her breath hitched. The air in the cabin suddenly felt very thin. William Bauer, Silas said quietly. He was looking right at her. Your maiden name before you married the judge, Brennan told me. Abby touched the signature. Her fingers trembled. He was my father. The silence wrapped around them. It wasn't cold. It was profound. He was the doctor, Silas said. His voice broke just a little. He came up the mountain in a blizzard. I rode down to town begging for help, and nobody would come, but he came. He stayed for 3 days. He saved Margaret's life that year. Abby closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek. My father kept a journal, too. Before he died, he gave it to me. He wrote about Bear Ridge. He wrote about the Montgomery place. He said you were good people. Silas stared at her. The sheer weight of it settled over them. Abby hadn't just wandered up this mountain by chance. She had been guided by a man who believed in kindness, by a man who had seen the goodness in the Montgomery family, long before the town decided Silas was a monster. He pointed you here, Silas whispered. Yes, Abby said. She wiped her cheek. She looked up at him. He knew I would be safe. Silas swallowed hard. He looked at the floor, overwhelmed. He had accused her of being a spy. He had accused her of betrayal. And all along, she was the daughter of the man who had fought to keep his family alive. He didn't apologize again. Words weren't enough. He just looked at her and made a silent vow to never doubt her again. We have to go to town, Abby said, breaking the silence. She closed the ledger. We have to find the remaining 7 families. Cornelius is bringing his men on Monday. We have to stop him today. Coldwater Creek was freezing. The wind howled down Main Street, kicking up clouds of icy dust. Silas and Abby rode in side by side. People stopped. They stared. The savage of Bear Ridge was back, and the refined widow of Judge Preston was riding right beside him. They didn't stop at the general store. They rode straight to the town hall. Cornelius Preston's black buggy was parked out front. Abby dismounted. She didn't wait for Silas to tie the horses. She marched up the wooden steps. Silas was right behind her, a massive, silent shadow. She pushed the heavy double doors open. Inside, the town hall was crowded. Cornelius stood at the front, flanked by his Denver lawyer and the U.S. Marshal. Sitting in the wooden pews were the farmers, Miguel Ortega, Old Man Swenson, the heads of the 7 families. They looked beaten, tired, defeated. Cornelius was speaking. "It is a generous offer, $200 a farm. The water will be diverted by spring. If you don't sell your land to the railroad now, it will be worthless dust by July." "It's a robbery," Miguel Ortega muttered, twisting his hat in his hands. "But we ain't got the money to fight you in Denver." "You don't have to go to Denver." A clear, ringing voice echoed through the hall. Every head turned. Abby stood in the center aisle. She wore her heavy wool coat. Her head was high. Silas stood 3 paces behind her. He didn't look angry. He looked like a mountain, immovable. Cornelius's cruel smile vanished. "Abigail, what is the meaning of this? This is a private legal meeting." "It is a public hall, Cornelius," Abby said. She walked down the aisle. The farmers parted for her. "And you are attempting a public theft." She reached the front. She didn't look at the lawyer. She didn't look at the marshal. She looked right at the 7 farmers. "Mr. Ortega, Mr. Swenson," Abby addressed them. Her voice was strong, rhythmic. "My husband kept many secrets, but he kept meticulous records. My brother-in-law here is trying to use an 1848 territorial loophole to steal the Bear Ridge Creek." The farmers muttered. They looked at each other. "He can't do it," Abby said. She pulled the heavy leather ledger from her satchel. She slammed it down on the front table. Dust puffed into the air. "In 1864, your fathers and Silas's father signed a mutual-use water pact. It was filed with Judge Crawford. I have the original log right here." Cornelius stepped forward, his face flushed red. "That is an ancient piece of paper. It holds no weight against a federal judge's injunction." "It holds every weight," Abby countered, turning on him. She didn't flinch. "Under the Homestead Act of 1862, prior continuous community use supersedes territorial claims. It requires unanimous consent to divert the water." She looked back at the farmers. "He needs your signatures to change the water flow. That's why he's trying to buy you out today. If you hold the line, his injunction is dead paper." Miguel Ortega stood up. He looked at Silas, then he looked at Abby. "Is this true, ma'am?" "It is," Abby promised. Cornelius scoffed. He looked at the farmers. "Are you going to listen to a grieving widow and a madman? I have the money, I have the men. You fight me, I will bleed you dry in court fees for a decade." The farmers hesitated. Fear was a powerful thing. Cornelius was rich. They were scraping by on dirt and ice. Abby saw the hesitation. She felt the heavy silence in the room. She didn't plead, she didn't cry. She stood tall, squared her shoulders, and delivered the truth. "Listen to me," Abby said, her voice cutting through the hall like a silver bell. Every eye was locked on her. "Water and land are not privileges for wealthy men to carve up in boardrooms. They are human rights. They are the very lifeblood of these families." She pointed a finger directly at Cornelius. "A civilized society is measured by how fiercely it protects its most vulnerable," Abby declared, the words ringing off the wooden rafters. "It is not measured by how much its rich can hoard. Men like Cornelius rely on your isolation. They rely on your fear. But he is one man, and you are a community. We will not surrender our right to exist so he can line his pockets." Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. Then Miguel Ortega put his hat on his head. He looked at Cornelius. "My father signed that pact," Ortega said. "I ain't selling my farm. and I ain't signing over the water. Old man Swenson stood up next. Neither am I. One by one, the 7 men stood up. They formed a wall of worn canvas and flannel. They stood next to Abby. They stood next to Silas. Cornelius looked at the wall of men. He looked at the ledger. He knew he was beaten. The U.S. Marshal sighed. He tipped his hat to Abby. Well, ma'am, seems you have a valid legal counter. I can't enforce the injunction without a hearing on that pact. The dig is officially halted. Cornelius's face was purple with rage. He glared at Abby. Abby didn't blink. She had survived 12 years with a monster. Cornelius was just a bully in a suit. Get off our mountain, Cornelius, Abby said quietly. And don't come back. The town hall emptied out. The farmers shook Silas's hand. They tipped their hats to Abby. For the first time in years, the people of Coldwater Creek looked at the giant of Bear Ridge and didn't see a savage. They saw a neighbor. Cornelius was the last to leave. His lawyer was already practically running for the buggy. Cornelius stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps. He looked up at Abby. The mask of the polite gentleman was completely gone. Only the ugly, grasping greed remained. You're a fool, Abigail, Cornelius spat. His breath plumed in the freezing air. You could have come to Denver. I would have set you up in a nice house, given you a stipend. You could have lived like a lady. Abby stood on the top step. Silas stood a few feet away, letting her handle it. He knew she didn't need him to fight this battle. A lady. Abby repeated the word. It tasted like ash. You mean a prisoner? You mean a well-fed dog tied to the porch? I mean safe, Cornelius snapped. You chose a freezing cabin and a brute. You've ruined your reputation. You have nothing. I have exactly what I want, Abby said calmly. I have my mind. I have my voice. And I am entirely free of the Preston name. Cornelius sneered. He turned, climbed into his buggy, and whipped the horses. The wheels kicked up frozen mud as he sped out of Coldwater Creek, taking his greed back to the city. Abby watched him go. She took a deep breath. The icy air filled her lungs. It didn't burn. It felt crisp, clean. Silas stepped up beside her. He looked down at the muddy ruts left by the buggy. He won't come back, Silas said. No, Abby agreed. Bullies never fight when the odds are even. They walked to their horses. Silas took the reins of the roan mare and handed them to her. His huge hands brushed hers. The touch was light, careful. They rode back up Bear Ridge. The journey took 2 hours. The sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gold. The cold was biting, but the heavy, suffocating dread that had hung over the mountain for a week was gone. The forest felt different. It felt like it was breathing again. They reached the clearing. The cabin stood strong against the snow. The barn was quiet. Silas took the horses. Abby went inside. She built the fire. She struck the match, watched the dry pine needles catch, and fed the kindling until the flames roared in the stone hearth. The warmth spread through the small room. She put the coffee pot on the iron hook. The door opened. Silas stepped inside. He had taken off his heavy coat. He stood by the door for a long moment, just watching her. Abby turned around. The firelight danced across her face. The silence between them wasn't tense. It wasn't the heavy, guarded silence of 2 strangers making a bargain. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the smoke has cleared. Silas walked to the oak table. He pulled out a chair, but he didn't sit. He rested his hands on the back of the wood. His knuckles were white. The man who had faced down armed thugs and Denver lawyers looked terrified. Abby, he said. His voice was a low rumble. Yes, Silas. He looked at the floorboards. Then he forced himself to look up, to meet her eyes. The winter agreement, Silas started. He cleared his throat. We said you would work for your keep until the thaw. Then you would go. Abby felt a sudden sharp ache in her chest. She kept her face perfectly still. That was the agreement. The thaw is a few months away, Silas continued. He gripped the back of the chair tighter. But the threat is gone. You proved your claim. You saved this farm. You don't owe me any labor. If you want to take a train somewhere, I have some gold pieces buried under the floor. I can pay your passage, anywhere you want to go. Abby stared at him. Are you asking me to leave? No, Silas said quickly. Too quickly. He let go of the chair. He took a step toward her. God, no. That's the last thing I want. He stopped. He took a ragged breath. He was stripping away the last of his armor, dropping it right there on the floor. I don't have much, Abby, Silas said, his voice raw. I have this dirt. I have some horses. I have a lot of ghosts. I'm a hard man. I don't know how to talk pretty. I don't know how to be a gentleman. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. But I know what you gave me, Silas said softly. You looked at a monster and saw a man. You didn't run from my pain. You sat with me in the dark. I don't want to offer you a roof for your labor. I don't want to offer you protection like you're some fragile thing. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. I want to offer you a partnership, Silas asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. I am asking you to stay, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because I want you here, more than anything. Abby looked up into his dark, guarded eyes. They weren't guarded anymore. They were completely open, completely vulnerable. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't telling her what she was going to do. He was asking. He was giving her the power to choose. Josiah had demanded her obedience. Cornelius had demanded her submission. Silas was asking for her hand. Abby stepped away from the fire. She closed the distance between them. She reached up. She placed her hands flat against his broad chest. She felt his heart hammering against his ribs, fast and hard. Silas Montgomery, Abby said softly. He swallowed. Yes. Abby looked deeply into his eyes. She didn't smile. She wanted him to hear every single word. She wanted him to know exactly what this was. True love is never about possession or control, Abby told him, the words carrying the weight of a hard-won truth. It is not a cage, no matter how nicely it is painted. It is a voluntary partnership between two free, equal individuals who respect one another. Silas didn't move. He just listened, earning every word. You did not try to fix me, Abby continued, her voice softening, filling with a profound warmth. You gave me the space to breathe. You gave me the space to find my voice again. You treated my mind with respect, and you treated my heart with care. She slid her hands up his chest, resting them gently on his wide shoulders. You are asking me to choose, Abby said. A beautiful, genuine smile finally broke across her face. And I am telling you my answer. I choose to stay. I choose to give you my heart, Silas, entirely of my own free will. Silas let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He didn't grab her. He didn't crush her to him. He slowly, carefully wrapped his massive arms around her waist. He pulled her gently against his chest. Abby rested her head against him. She closed her eyes. He felt like a mountain. But for the first time in her life, the mountain wasn't something to climb. It was a place to rest. Outside, the freezing wind battered the heavy logs of the cabin. The winter was far from over. But inside, standing by the fire, holding the giant of Bear Ridge, Abby finally felt the thaw begin. April came to Bear Ridge. It didn't sneak in. It broke the door down. The ice cracked. It sounded like rifle shots echoing through the timber. The snow turned to slush, then to mud, then to rushing, angry water. The creek roared to life. It spilled over the rocks loud and free, carrying the dead weight of winter down into the valley. The thaw had finally come. Abby stood on the front porch of the cabin. The morning air was crisp. It smelled of wet pine needles and dark, rich earth. She didn't wear morning black anymore. Those heavy wool dresses had been burned in the hearth back in February. Today she wore a simple dress of deep blue cotton. No lace, no corset pulling her ribs tight. Just clean fabric that let her breathe. She heard the crunch of boots on the gravel. Silas walked around the side of the cabin. He had trimmed his beard. He wore a clean canvas shirt and his best dark trousers. He looked massive. He looked solid. But he didn't look dangerous. He looked like a man who had finally put down a burden he had carried for far too long. He walked up the wooden steps. He stopped in front of her. He held out his hand. "Mr. Brennan just rode into the clearing," Silas said quietly. "His horse is winded, but he made it." "Good," Abby smiled. She placed her hand in his fingers wrapped around hers, warm, rough, safe. They didn't walk to a church. They didn't walk to town. They walked to the back of the cabin, to the edge of the tree line. The two tiny rock-lined graves were clear of snow. Little green shoots of mountain grass were pushing up through the dirt around the white river stones. Life was coming back. Old Man Brennan stood near a large spruce tree. He held a worn leather Bible in his hands. He was out of breath from the steep ride, but his eyes were bright. He was the only guest. He was the only one they needed. "Well," Brennan wheezed, patting his chest, "I ain't a preacher. Told you that down in town. But I got the good book, and I got a legal license from the county clerk to witness a union. Reckon that makes it binding." "It's enough for us," Silas said. Brennan nodded. He opened the book, mostly for show. He cleared his throat. "We are gathered here, on this mountain, before God, and before the memory of those who rest here." He looked at the graves. He tipped his hat. "To join Silas Montgomery and Abigail Preston." He looked at them. Two people who had lost everything. Two people who had clawed their way back to the light. "You got words you want to say to each other?" Brennan asked. "Now's the time." Silas turned to Abby. He didn't let go of her hand. He looked down into her eyes. The giant of the mountain, the man who used to hide in silence. "I learned something up here," Silas said. His voice was a deep, steady rumble in the morning air. "I learned that a man can lose everything he loves and his heart will still beat. He can still chop wood. He can still breathe. But breathing ain't living. I was just a ghost, haunting my own land." He squeezed her fingers. "I thought shutting the world out made me strong," Silas told her. "I was wrong. You taught me that. I want a life with you. I don't want to hide anymore. I don't want to be afraid of losing. I choose this. I choose you, every single day." Abby looked at him. The tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but they were tears of profound joy. "For 12 years, I was taught that my survival depended on my silence," Abby said. Her voice was rhythmic, clear as a bell. "I was taught that a woman is a passenger in her own life, that peace is found by making yourself small." She took a breath. She looked at the man who had given her the space to grow large again. "You taught me that my voice matters," Abby promised him. "You showed me that a home is not a cage. I choose to stand here, with you, beside the people you loved and the life we are going to build. I am yours, Silas, not by law but by choice." Brennan sniffled. He rubbed his nose with the back of his sleeve. "Well then," Brennan said, his voice thick, "by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you man and wife. You seal it now." Silas didn't grab her. He reached up, cupped her face in his large, calloused hands, and kissed her. It was gentle. It was real. It was a promise signed in breath and heartbeat. When they pulled apart, Abby reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small handful of dried bluebonnets she had saved from the town store. She knelt in the dirt. She placed half the flowers on Margaret's grave. She placed the other half on baby Rose's grave. She stood back up. Silas put his arm around her shoulders. They didn't walk away from the past. They simply brought it with them into the sunshine. A week later, they rode down the mountain, together. They didn't stop at the general store. They rode straight to the law office of Jeremiah Holt. The bell above the door chimed. Holt looked up from his heavy mahogany desk. He saw the giant in canvas. He saw the woman in the blue dress. He swallowed hard. The sweat beaded instantly on his forehead. "Mr. Montgomery," Holt stammered, standing up. "Mrs. Preston." "It's Mrs. Montgomery now," Abby said flatly. Holt blinked. "Yes, of course, congratulations. What can my office do for you?" Abby walked to the desk. She pulled a rolled parchment from her leather satchel. She laid it flat on the wood. It was the deed to the Bear Ridge farm. "We are here to amend the property title," Abby said. "I have drafted the necessary legal language. We require your notary seal to file it with the territory." Holt adjusted his spectacles. He looked at the paper, then his brow furrowed. "Mrs. Montgomery, you have listed yourself as a full co-owner of the property, alongside your husband." "I have," Abby said. Holt looked at Silas, as if expecting the large man to correct his foolish wife. Silas just stood there, his arms crossed, his face a wall of stone. He was letting Abby handle the hammer. "Sir," Holt addressed Silas nervously, "this is highly unusual. In Colorado, a husband manages the estate. A woman's name on a land deed. It complicates matters of credit. It is customary for the man to hold sole title." Abby planted her hands on the edge of the mahogany desk. She leaned in. "Listen to me carefully, Mr. Holt," Abby said. Her voice left absolutely no room for debate. "A marriage is not an acquisition. It is an equal enterprise. Society tells us that it is customary to erase a woman's identity the moment she says her vows. It tells us that the man owns the dirt and the woman simply sweeps it." Holt opened his mouth to argue, but Abby cut him off. "When the law refuses to put a woman's name on the land she bleeds for, it erases her humanity," Abby stated, the words striking the air like a gavel. "It reduces her from a partner to a dependent. Silas and I do not operate under the illusion of female dependency. We built this life together. We fought for this land together. And this deed will reflect the absolute truth. We are equal partners. In labor, in profit, and in the eyes of the law. Now, stamp the paper." Holt stared at her. He looked at Silas. Silas gave a single, slow nod. Holt picked up his heavy iron stamp. He inked it. He slammed it down on the parchment. When Abby walked out of the office, she held the rolled paper tightly in her fist. For the first time in her 38 years of life, she owned the ground beneath her boots. 3 years later. Autumn, 1882. The mountain was on fire with color. The aspens had turned a blinding gold. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and turning leaves. The Montgomery farm didn't look like a hideout anymore. It looked like a fortress of life. The barn had a new roof. The corral was expanded, holding 4 healthy quarter horses. A massive garden was fenced in near the creek, full of late-season squash and root vegetables. The rhythmic clang, clang, clang of a heavy hammer on an anvil rang through the clear air. Silas was in the forge. Inside the cabin, the morning sun streamed through the open window. Abby sat at the oak table. She wore a pair of reading glasses she had bought in Denver the year prior. A heavy stack of bound paper sat to her left. Her father's old medical journal sat to her right. She dipped her pen in the inkwell. She was writing. She wasn't just copying her father's notes. She was adding to them. She had spent the last 3 years trading knowledge with the Cheyenne women who camped in the valley during the summers. She had learned which roots stopped bleeding, which barks broke a fever. She was writing a practical, common-sense medical guide for frontier families who lived too far from a town doctor. Mr. Brennan had found a publisher in Denver who wanted to print it. Next spring, it would be a real book, bound in leather. Heavy, hurried footsteps pounded on the porch. The door swung open. It was Clara, the youngest daughter of Miguel Ortega. She was 8 years old. She had 2 missing front teeth, a mess of dark pigtails, and a face streaked with dirt and tears. Clara was holding something small and brown against her chest. "Miss Abby!" Clara cried out, her chest heaving. "Miss Abby, you gotta help." Abby immediately put her pen down. She stood up, taking her glasses off. "Clara, what is it? Are you hurt?" "Not me." Clara sniffled loudly. She held out her hands. Cradled in her small, dirty palms was a young brown hen. One of its wings hung at a strange, broken angle. A fox got into the coop. Papa shot at it, but it bit Henrietta. Her wing is broke. Papa said to wring its neck for soup, but she's my favorite. Clara looked up at Abby with massive, desperate brown eyes. Abby didn't smile. She didn't treat it like a child's foolish game. She treated the girl's grief with absolute respect. "Bring her here to the table, Clara," Abby said gently. She moved her manuscript to the side. She laid out a clean flour sack. Clara carefully set the shivering bird down. Abby examined the wing. The bone was snapped, but the skin wasn't badly torn. It was fixable. She went to her medical cabinet. She pulled out 2 small flat splints of cedar wood and a roll of clean cotton bandage. "Can you hold her steady for me?" Abby asked. Clara nodded, biting her lip. She placed her small hands gently over the bird's back. As Abby worked, setting the tiny bone, Clara watched her intently. "Miss Abby," Clara whispered, "why do you fix the little things? Papa says a chicken ain't worth the bandage." Abby finished tying the knot on the splint. She wiped her hands on her apron. She pulled a chair out and sat down so she was at eye level with the little girl. "Your papa is a practical man, Clara," Abby told her. "He has to think about feeding your family, but there is another kind of value in this world besides food and money." She pointed to the bandaged bird. "When someone is hurt, no matter how small they are vulnerable," Abby explained, making sure the child heard the lesson clearly. "Society often teaches us to throw away what is broken. It teaches us that weakness is a burden, but that is a cruel lie. True compassion means we do not turn our backs on suffering simply because it is inconvenient. We bind the wing. We offer a safe place, because teaching ourselves to care for the least of things is how we learn to care for each other." Clara stared at her. The tears had stopped. The lesson sank deep into her young mind. She nodded slowly. "Thank you, Miss Abby," Clara whispered. "Keep her in a small box by the stove for a week," Abby instructed. "Don't let her try to fly. She will heal." Clara scooped the bird back up, careful of the splint. She turned and ran out the door, her boots thumping happily across the porch. Abby watched her go. She felt a massive presence fill the doorway. She turned her head. Silas was leaning against the doorframe. He had an old rag in his hands, wiping the soot from his fingers. He had heard the whole exchange. He didn't look like a savage. He didn't look dangerous. He looked at Abby with a love so deep and profound it could have moved the mountain they lived on. He didn't say a word. He just smiled. A slow, warm, beautiful smile. Abby smiled back. The quiet between them was perfect. It was the sound of a home. Silas walked back to the forge. The hammer started ringing again, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the crisp autumn air. Abby sat back down at the table. She picked up her pen. She looked at her manuscript. She looked at the title page. The Mountain Healer, a practical guide for the frontier. She turned to the next blank page. She needed to write an introduction, a preface to explain why she was writing this book, why healing mattered. She dipped her pen in the ink. The nib scratched smoothly across the heavy paper. She didn't write about Josiah. She didn't write about the cruelty of Coldwater Creek. She wrote about the truth she had found in the snow. "They called him a monster," Abby wrote, the ink flowing dark and permanent. "They warned me that the mountain man was dangerous, because society always demonizes what it cannot control. Men who weep for their children and women who think for themselves, these are terrifying concepts to a world built on rigid power." She paused. She looked out the window. She could see the top of Silas's head through the open door of the blacksmith shed. She touched the pen back to the paper. "But on this mountain, standing in the bitter cold, I learned the fundamental truth of the human spirit, she continued. I learned that educational degrees and fine clothes do not make a person civilized. Empathy does. She pressed harder on the pen. She wanted these words to last 100 years. Healing does not mean erasing your scars, Abby wrote. It means looking at the jagged edges of what broke you and choosing to use those edges to understand the pain of someone else. When we stop demanding that people be flawless, when we grant each other absolute equality and the right to be vulnerable, a miracle happens. Even the most barren, winter-struck hearts can learn to bloom again. We save ourselves simply by choosing to save each other. Abby finished the sentence. She set the pen down. She blew softly on the ink to dry it. She closed the journal. The house was warm. The mountain was quiet. The ghosts were finally at rest. Abigail Montgomery stood up, walked to the stove to pour a cup of coffee, and stepped out onto the porch to watch her husband work in the autumn sun. Our channel brings you emotional Western stories about cowboys, frontier romance, motherly love, kindness, sympathy, forgiveness, and the bonds that make people human. If this story warmed your heart, please give it a like. Tell us what lesson touched you most in the comments. Share it with someone who loves Western drama, and subscribe for more heartfelt frontier stories. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
In the end, this Western tale is not only about a widow, a mountain man, a stolen creek, or a fight against a greedy man in a fine suit. It is a story about what happens when broken people refuse to stay broken. Abby Preston teaches us that freedom is not something handed to us by society, by law, or by the people who claim to know what is best for us. Freedom begins the moment a person finds the courage to say, "I am more than what others have made me." She had been silenced, controlled, and dismissed for years, yet she never allowed her mind or her spirit to die. Silas Montgomery, on the other hand, reminds us that strength is not measured by how much pain a man can hide, or how fiercely he can frighten others. True strength is found in restraint, honesty, grief, protection, and the courage to open one's heart again after devastating loss. The value of this story lies in its quiet but powerful message. People are often more than the rumors told about them. The town saw Abby as a helpless widow. They saw Silas as a dangerous beast. But both of them carried truths no one had bothered to understand. Through respect, patience, and compassion, they discovered that healing does not come from control, fear, or pride. It comes from being seen clearly, accepted honestly, and trusted freely. Their bond shows us that love is not possession. Love is not rescue. Love is not one person standing above another. Real love is a partnership between two free souls who choose each other without chains, without demands, and without fear. This story also reminds us of the power of community. Cornelius Preston believed that money, law, and intimidation could divide ordinary people and steal what kept them alive. But when Abby found the truth, and the farmers stood together, greed lost its power. The lesson is timeless. When people stand alone, fear can break them. But when they stand together, even the powerful must step back. Land, water, dignity, and justice should never belong only to those rich enough to buy them. They belong to the people who build, protect, and share them. So may this story leave us with a deeper understanding of compassion. May it remind us not to judge too quickly, not to mistake silence for weakness, not to mistake tears for failure, and not to mistake kindness for surrender. Every person carries a hidden battle. Every heart deserves the chance to be understood. And sometimes, in the harshest winter, on the loneliest mountain, two wounded souls can still find warmth, purpose, and a reason to begin again.